Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. I've recently come back from 10 weeks at sea on board HMS Queen Elizabeth, doing operational sea training and carrier strike training, where we developed and learnt how we're going to operate a carrier strike group in peacetime and then eventually, if something bad happens, in wartime. So that was interesting. Although it was a very long 10 weeks. Hey ho, I'm back. I'm going to continue where I left off with my YouTube videos, which was actually working through the Falklands War before I kind of ran out of time and had to deploy. So, oh well, never mind. Let's continue, shall we? The SS Atlantic Conveyor was a 14,950 ton roll-on, roll-off container ship owned by Cunard, or for short, a co-row. She was one of 6 G2 class vessels built, with the Atlantic Crown and Cinderella being operated by the Holland America Line. The Atlantic Cognac and Champagne were operated by the French General Transatlantique Company, and finally the Atlantic Conveyor and her sister ship the Causeway would be operated by Cunard. She, along with her sister ships, would be built on the Tyne by Swan Hunter and delivered to Cunard in 1970 as part of their contribution to the Atlantic Container Line Consortium. However, these ships would be revolutionary in more ways than one. The major one being the combining of the ro-ro concept and a container ship, thus increasing the range of produce being carried by these vessels. The arrangement of this combination would be 20 ISO containers on the foredeck and 3 banks of 40 ISO containers held in vertical storages that penetrated the deck, exactly the same as your standard container ship. Now along with that, the vessels had vehicle decks located aft of these containers. And these also went abaft the container storages. Now she would have a stern ramp as well for loading and unloading these said vehicles. Herself and her sister ships would be 212 metres long, with a beam of 28 metres and a draft in the area of around about 8 metres, give or take, depending on the season. Her machinery consisted of 2 steam boilers powering 2 shafts for up to 23 knots. Alongside these steam power plants powering the ship, she also had diesel generators, which produced power to an electric motor for both the single rudder and the ship's bow thrusters. She would have a crew of 33 Merchant Navy personnel, consisted of 12 officers, which included the ship's master, chief officer, second officer, third officer, radio officer, chief engineer, second engineer, 2 third engineers, a fourth engineer, and finally a purser. 10 petty officers, including the boatswain, 4 mechanics, 2 first-class cooks, 1 second-class cook, and a baker, and finally a second-class steward. And finally, to round out the complement, there will be 11 ratings, of which were 5 seamen, 3 greasers, and finally 3 assistant stewards. But between her starting her service with Cunard and the Atlantic Container Line to her enrolment into the Falklands War, she would operate between Europe and North America, taking transatlantic routes from Liverpool and other western cities in the United Kingdom to the eastern seaboard of mainland United States. She would excel in this role due to her design, making her very economical and flexible with her cargoes. On April 2nd, 1982, the Falklands were invaded by the Argentinians, and by the 3rd, the Falklands War was on. The main task group, CCG 317, and his subsidiary groups had sailed for the Falklands, giving the British government a little breathing room to mount an invasion force. And so merchant ships were taken up from trade. And these were vessels in the likes of the SS Canberra, the RMS Queen Elizabeth II, and other vessels such as the Contender Bazan, the ship that would later become HMS Argus. Aside from those 3 ships, many more ships were actually taken up from trade. These were examples like ferries, cargo ships, container ships, and even co-rows like the Atlantic Causeway and the Atlantic Conveyor themselves. This, however, is actually legal. So UK forces are actually configured for Cold War NATO tasking and expeditionary capabilities, and as such, ships could be taken up for trade to basically become so-called auxiliaries to help with landings or funding the war effort if it actually went hot. And as such, overall, about 40 civilian ships were actually taken up for the conflict down the Falklands. And so, the Atlantic Conveyor's so-called wartime career would kind of start from here. So on the 14th of April, the MOD would actually meet, and it was basically clear that Argentina was not going to back down. And as such, the SS Atlantic Conveyor was designated as a transport ship to carry a number of replacement Harrier jump jets, as they expected that a few would be lost over the ground conflict, in a sense turning her into a quote-unquote merchant aircraft carrier, maybe? And so, on the 15th of April, she sailed from Liverpool to Devonport Dockyard in Plymouth, ready for her major conversion. Arriving the next day, she went into Dry Dock 10, where the work started in earnest to get the ship converted, ready for deck operations. In 10 days, she had her container stowage wells covered over, a replenishment at sea point put on the starboard side and midships. Other additions included the strengthening of the quarterdeck as well as the foredeck, essentially to have jets and helicopters land on board, as well as the addition of ammunition stores in containers located below the main deck. This would be loaded through the aft door. However, during this refit, no self-defense weapons nor decoy launchers were fitted, which would come to bite her in the port quarter in a couple of weeks' time. I thought I'd mention here that it's best to note that under international law, merchant vessels and their crews have the right to carry arms in self-defense if that is required that the vessel is to exercise its freedom of navigation. Self-defense measures included providing weapons and training to the crew or hiring armed guards to allow the vessel to navigate. Under this law, it would be legal to fit these ships with off-board decoy launchers, but she would not be fitted with such, as she was not seen as a HVU or a high-value unit. To make that slightly more clear, she's allowed to actually have self-defense weapons and decoy launchers, however she was never fitted with them, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. After her refitting, she would sail for testing with 809 Naval Air Squadron, and in turn certified she was ready for operations. With that now sorted, she would sail south alongside the MV Europic Ferry and the MV Nordland. By the 2nd of May, she arrived in Freetown in Sierra Leone for refueling and replenishment, and then continued down to Ascension Island, where she would arrive on the 5th. The pit stop would be an opportunity to offload a number of stores, as well as load and restow some existing stores. In addition to this, they actually used one of the Chinooks in the role of cross-ship stores running, or a vertical replenishment to other units. Her Harriers and Sea Harriers that she was designated to actually carry didn't sail with the ship, so they make a series of record-breaking single-seat ferry flights from the UK to the ship. By the time she sailed from Ascension Islands on the 7th, she had an addition of 8 Sea Harriers and 6 Harrier GR3 aircraft, which in addition to the 5 Chinooks, 6 Wessex and the handful of Wasp helicopters she sailed from Guz with, she had a complement of roughly about 25 aircraft on board, all stowed on the upper deck between the 2 rows of containers. By the 19th, the voyage to the MEZ, or Maritime Exclusion Zone, was over. Now during the trip, a single Harrier was kept on the forward flight deck as alert 20, meaning that she was ready to launch with 20 minutes notice. She was kept there to protect the force against an Argentine Air Force 707 Snooper, or reconnaissance aircraft, which was found at one stage to be providing intel on the movements of the force. However, they never actioned the alert on the aircraft due to the problem of no aerial tanker support, as well as the increasing temperatures and also the fuel-intensive vertical takeoff and landing. The mission would have been very challenging, and unfortunately, he cannot actually class the ship as an aircraft carrier now, so it didn't really have a combat launch. However, on the transit down, it wasn't all doom and gloom, however. There was actually an opportunity to take a picture, which you can see in the background, of the RAS that she actually had with the RFA Tide Pool, one of the Tide class tankers, and no, not the new ones, the old ones. After completing the RAS, HMS Hermes and Invincible closed with the Amphibious Task Force on the 19th of May, to allow the aircraft to transfer from the Atlantic Conveyor. However, with a few engine problems and difficult conditions, this transfer took slightly longer than planned, but by the 21st, all Harriers had been disembarked. During the short period that the Atlantic Conveyor stayed in close proximity to the battle group, she provided helicopter cargo support, in which 1 Chinook and 3 Wessex were actually used extensively. The first Chinook used would actually become the famous Bravo November, flown off the small rear deck. Now, fun fact about the small rear deck and taking off with a Chinook, you actually had to drop the rear ramp because the blade clearance would actually hit the ramp. So they had to drop it down to about a 45-degree angle to even get the Chinook off the deck. So you now may be thinking, the Harriers are now gone from the ship. That probably means that the mission was achieved for the Atlantic Conveyor. And in a sense, yes it was. Her primary mission, has been achieved. Now the secondary mission was to obviously, when the landings start, to get the Chinooks and the Wessexes off the ship. So they could basically transport the troops from the designated landing area, which was San Carlos Water, over to Stanley, which would be the capital of the Falklands. And in a sense, we'll be discussing that later on. By the 24th of May, the commanders of the British task force had actually felt increasing optimism. They'd technically achieved the impossible in a sense of getting a beachhead on the island. And as such, stores were being built up, and the combined forces had started to achieve the upper hand in the air war. Despite significant losses, however. Now, Argentine commanders correctly assumed that the opportunity to dislodge British forces from San Carlos had passed, and the best course of action was to disrupt the sustained blockade of the islands. And as such, they would try to capitalise on this. On the 25th of May, the Atlantic Conveyor was instructed to be ready to move into San Carlos Water on the 26th of May under cover of darkness, disembark all helicopters and begin transfer of all stores using maxi floats and landing craft at first light. Preparations on board continued, including moving stores to disembarkation points and ground testing some of the remaining helicopters. At 13:23 Zulu, HMS Coventry was struck by 3 bombs to the north of the Falklands, was trying to lure aircraft away from the landings in San Carlos Water. At 13:48 Zulu, HMS Coventry capsizes and sinks with 19 personnel on board. Unfortunately, however, this would be 1-0 to the Argentines on the 25th. At 1900 Zulu, the Atlantic Conveyor was sailing in consort with HMS Ambuscade, HMS Brilliant, and Hermes. On board the Atlantic Conveyor, the pre-positioning of stores for disembarkation of helo squadrons was complete on the aft deck. The ship's company involved in the action proceeded to leave Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie decks and ended up in their accommodation spaces, ready to get stand-downs for the evening. Still on the deck was a Chinook, which was a Bravo Tango, and this had completed a ground run and was in the process of disengaging her engines. At 1910 Zulu, Wessex side number Yankee Delta takes off from the Atlantic Conveyor for a test flight before conducting a short vertrep with the flagship HMS Hermes. At 1936 Zulu, 2 aircraft were picked up on one of the escort's radars, or Hermes herself. This was passed out over Orc. At the same time, 300 Agave 300. The Agave racket was passed on Ambuscade. This associated to Superintendants armed with the Exocet anti-ship missile. The range from the force was expected to be about 40 nautical miles, just outside the missile's release range. Over Orc, the comms channel dedicated to anti-air warfare coordination, Hamburg was called. The call sign associated to Super E's bombing radar. At 1937, 310 Agave 310. The Agave racket was picked up by HMS Exeter this time, located south of the force. By this point, it was very clear to all the ships in the fleet there was an Exeter raid inbound. At 1938 Zulu, on board the two Super E's, missile lock was acquired on HMS Ambuscade. By this point, the aircraft were within missile release range. By 1939 Zulu, the aircraft seemed to be turned outbound on radar. A dead reckoning track is input into the command system, coming from the aircraft, to know exactly where the possible missile pop-up is going to happen. On board Ambuscade, 6 seduction chaff rounds are fired for a full 360-degree coverage around the ship. On board Hermes and Brilliant, they both fire distraction chaff in hopes of basically distracting the missile. At 1939 Zulu and 41 seconds, 2 Exocets were picked up on radar. At the same time, the active seeker on the Exocet turns on and takes the bait for the chaff deployed by Ambuscade. However, it worked a little bit too well. At 1940 Zulu, hands to emergency stations was piped. In a sense, the Atlantic Conveyor went to emergency stations. All Royal Navy personnel on board, which were an extra 120 personnel who were there to tend to the aircraft and munitions, went to their quote-unquote action stations, meaning fire hoses and damage control points were manned and ready. Her merchant navy personnel also went to the same place, ready just in case the ship was about to take some damage. At the same time, she was to turn hard to port to 040. At the same time, HMS Invincible, who was operating a few miles from Hermes, finished launching her combat air patrol, although vectoring them to the north to prevent a blue-on-blue action. At 1942 Zulu, a missile was sighted from Red 150, 150 degrees from the ship's bow to the port side, or, essentially, the port quarter. "Hit the deck!" was piped over the main broadcast. She would be hit by 2 Exocets on the port quarter, in line with the aft end of the superstructure, 10 to 12 feet above the waterline, entering cargo deck C in the vicinity of the lift shaft. According to the official Board of Inquiry, it is expected that 8 people were known to be between these decks at the time of the missile hit. However, with the missile hit, the missile exploded, causing dense, acrid air and smoke to vent through the whole side of the ship, as well as through the uptakes, and also to go basically down throughout the ship. With this, the ship's boilers went out, the shafts stopped turning, putting the ship dead in the water, and all the ship's internal telephones were lost. At 1943 Zulu, vent fans of crash stopped from the bridge to try and limit the spread of noxious gas and deadly smoke from filling the rest of the ship. Sound-powered telephones, however, were the only way to communicate between damage control teams and the command team. However, this would take time to actually set up. By 1945 Zulu, there were attempts to release the starboard bridge wing lifebuoy after a man was spotted overboard. However, the release pin broke off in the releasee's hand. The lifebuoy released and hit the water about 1,000 yards away from the said man overboard. Wessex, Yankee Delta, which launched from the Hermes, would in turn be able to recover the man. The helo, however, was directed to the man via UHF radio from the aircraft controller on board HMS Hermes, as HF comms from the Atlantic Conveyor was, well, it's kind of understandable, a bit dead. Aside from that, boundary clearing started to commence on Deck 1, with firefighting teams using their firefighting nozzles in the ragged spray mode to try and stop the spread of heat from the fires down below. However, by this point, due to the heat and explosions, the aft lift shaft, which connects the aft engine room to the cargo decks, had actually collapsed. Now, luckily for the Board of Inquiry later on, it has been reported that the Wessex, Yankee Delta, which was currently doing the man overboard, had observed deep-rooted fires through the entry holes in the port quarter, indicating that there was a massive inferno going on inside the ship's cargo decks. By 1949 Zulu, smoke had been reported to have penetrated as far as the forward damage control party station in the forward machinery room. However, by this point there was actually no evidence there was a fire on A deck. By 1950 Zulu, attempts to close all the fan flaps was unsuccessful, resulting in smoke being able to slowly travel throughout the ship. By this point, the auxiliary generator room was now in use, but the emergency conning position was evacuated due to it being untenable. It was seen to be a good idea that the ditching of ammunition was paramount to the longevity of the ship, and so grenades and 7.62mm ammunition was being ditched off the after end of the flight deck. By 1952 Zulu, thick black smoke was reported to have filled Deck A. However, no heat nor damage had been reported. The forward damage control party moved to the upper deck due to the forward end of the ship now being untenable due to the rising levels of smoke. In 1956 Zulu, the CO2 fire extinguisher system was activated on board to try and extinguish the fires. However, the ship's high-pressure salt water firefighting main lost pressure. On the upper decks, there was a risk of heat setting fire to the AVCAT, which was stored in containers on the upper deck. Hence, they started pumping it into the sea. Now, it is to note that it was at least 11 minutes between missile impact and the activation of the CO2 fire extinguisher systems, which is unbelievably long in duration between missile impact and actually starting it, which is possibly one of the reasons why they couldn't actually save the ship, due to the fact that lots of fire and heat had traversed from the missile impact. It's not good, and it'll come up in the Board of Inquiry exactly. That was one of the key reasons the ship would sink. In 1957 Zulu, HMS Alacrity was asked if the Atlantic Conveyor had been settling by the stern. However, she did reply negative, so HMS Alacrity on the Atlantic Conveyor's starboard quarter started by to boundary cool from 50 yards. However, this would actually prove to be ineffective. The RFA Sir Percival was standing by on the Atlantic Conveyor's port quarter to render assistance as well. By 1958, it was sunset, and by 1959, the ship's fire main pressure had been restored. At 2000 Zulu, several explosions from the aft of sea deck area occurred. Small arms ammunition and phosphorus grenades were ditched off the aft flight deck, and 3 men succumbed to smoke and were treated by the first aid cleaning station. At the same time, HMS Alacrity closed to the starboard side aft to boundary cool the ship's side, and RFA Sir Percival closed to the port quarter but was unable to assist due to the dense smoke, and they also, however, reported there was flames coming out throughout the aft hole from where the missile impacted. By 2003, the ship's main broadcast system was lost, and hence they had to start using messengers. Now, there was also consideration given to spreading out and launching Wessexes from the forward flight deck. However, this was discounted in order to keep the forward spot clear for airborne Kazievacs. Between 2005 and 2015 Zulu, the fire was assessed to be now out of control, and the risk of the fire spreading to the forward quote-unquote magazine area was now paramount, which the magazine at this point contained cluster bombs and kerosene, two things that don't bode well or mix well with fire. So by this point, non-involved personnel were told to muster on the starboard side of one deck, and survival suits were donned, the order being given by one of the senior officers. It is not actually said who, but it'll be one of the senior officers. Now, explosions down below in the lower decks were more frequent and pronounced, and shrapnel could be seen coming through the ship's side. By this point, the aft flight deck had become unattainable because of the dense smoke and heat from the fires below. The abandoned ship order was given. However, it was to stand fast on the fire parties. Alacrity was asked to look out for any survivors who missed the rafts and drifted aft. 3 ladders were put over the starboard side, with 4 life rafts launched over the starboard side. It's probably best to note that actually the port side was pretty much untenable due to the fact that, well, there's loads of smoke and loads of fire coming out the side of the ship. So the starboard side was the side to go to, basically. Now, 3 life rafts would actually be stowed below racks, so these actually took a couple of minutes to launch. In a sense, that would be the second wave of people to basically abandon ship. Now, by 2010 Zulu, the decision by the captain was made to actually abandon the ship, and as such, the forward and aft DC parties were informed to abandon ship. Wessex Yankee Delta landed on the forward end of the ship to pick up 15 members of the flight deck damage control party and the forward damage control party. A Sea King landed on immediately afterwards to pick up several members of the forward DC parties, with both helos being recovered to HMS Hermes. By this point, HMS Alacrity again made attempts to come alongside the ship on the starboard aft side, but unfortunately had to pull away due to the difference in the heights of the weather decks, especially due to the fact that, well, she chopped 2 ladders off in the process. Now, it was seen that loads of people were actually coming down the side of the ship to basically escape the massive inferno that was occurring on the aft end of the ship. By 2035 Zulu, the order to cut all static lines from the life rafts was given, in a sense, so the life rafts would not be attached to the ship. And so, Alacrity, being close to the ship, would fire small arms gun lines over the life rafts so they can basically pull themselves to the ship. From 2100 to 2300, 6 life rafts were pulled alongside Alacrity. Now by this point, Alacrity would then go astern to clear the Atlantic Conveyors area just in case her magazine, quote unquote, detonated. Now by 2120, 1 life raft drifted around the Alacrity's bow, and in a sense 5 to 6 people had to go on lifelines to make sure they were not lost. By 2140, personnel from the 6th life raft were recovered on board HMS Alacrity. By 2220, Brilliant's seaboat came alongside the final raft and took on 2 survivors. By 2225, Sea Kings from HMS Invincible lifts 2 survivors from Brilliant's seaboats. 2230, the Sea King from Hermes lifts off 5 survivors from the final life raft that were remaining at sea. By 2300, the remaining life raft alongside HMS Brilliant were recovered with 24 survivors on board. On the 26th of May, which was the Wednesday, a helicopter from HMS Hermes would photograph the burnt out wreck with her bow intact. One of these photos would be the one you currently see at the moment, and a few others were obviously used a bit further back in the video. On Thursday the 27th of May, the landed conveyor was sighted at 5030 south, 5451 west. Now the vessel appeared to be completely burnt out. The bow section, containing all the kerosene and cluster bombs, had been blown to smithereens. Now the tug, called the Irishman, connected a tow to the Atlantic conveyor. However, about 25 minutes later the tow was parted, and by 2300 of the same day, the tow was reconnected. On the 28th, which was the Friday, 2 days after the attack, at 0350 Zulu, the tow parted, and it's believed that the midships and stern sections presumably sunk. By 0700, 3 containers were found floating. Now, the Atlantic conveyor has been presumed sunk by that point, and the position of these said containers was 5040.9 south, 5428.9 west. After she had sunk, there was a roll call to be done to basically work out who had actually survived. Unfortunately, however, 12 members of the ship's company had perished, including the ship's captain, Captain Ian H. North, DSC, Merchant Navy. Now, due to the ship sinking in wartime, or technically a conflict, with the number of RFA and RN personnel perishing on board, the MOD set up a board of inquiry to assess what happened on board, the crew's actions, and also to assess why she had sunk and if she could actually have been saved. Now, during this inquiry, they assessed that following 9 months of being laid up in Liverpool prior to her sailing to Devonport, a considerable amount of maintenance was carried out in her machinery compartments, meaning she had been very well maintained. However, there was a couple of minor problems when she raised steam prior to sailing, which had been overcome quite quickly. Now, on the 15th of April, a survey was conducted by Lloyd's Register, which conducted its quarterly survey of the hull and machinery. The only defects that were found were quite minor ones and didn't stop her from sailing. However, she would pick up 3 major defects by the time she got into the areas of operation. Now I'm going to read you a section of the official Board of Inquiry to basically state what they had said about the ship before she essentially sailed to Devonport and then after Devonport. So, it states that the Atlantic Conveyor has stated that the standard of maintenance in the machinery compartments was high, with a clearly lower standard of husbandry and cosmetics being apparent above and below the decks, as would be expected. Devonport Dockyard was responsible for the completion of the conversion work of the Atlantic Conveyor, and has commented on the generally good condition of the ship. In the event, the only shortcoming identified in the material state which could have, but did not influence events, was the inability to release the lifebuoy, together with its smoke float, from the starboard bridge wing, when man overboard alarm was given shortly after the missile struck. The smoke float was released, and this, combined with the clear instruction from the Atlantic Conveyor, was significant for the approaching helicopter to recover the survivor after a very short period in the water, which is good. Technically, end quote there. Now, by the time of the attack, like I mentioned earlier on and alluded to, there was a couple of major defects that were found. And in a sense, this was on her bow thruster and stabilisers, which had become inoperable since leaving the UK, and the engine room fire pump was inoperable since the start of the voyage from Ascension Islands to the Falklands. However, the bow thruster wasn't going to save the ship, and the stabilisers did not affect flight operations, but it did affect how tight the ship could turn, especially at high speeds, like, for example, an anti-ship missile defence course or an ASMD course. However, the engine room pump would be a little bit more critical as it hampered the firefighting efforts on board. Now, turning to the damage control effects. It was found that the use of the CO2 system being activated sometime after the fire had started was the reason the fire had grown to become an unfightable fire, and as such, due to the heat that detonations were going on, would be inevitable. However, boundary cooling was underway, but the issue is the ship's internals. It's probably understandable that a co-row, or ro-ro, is not the perfect vessel to take damage, and the internals are not designed to limit fire and smoke. On warships, they have large cavernous areas on board, like a carrier. They would have a retractable smoke curtain. On the Atlantic Conveyor, however, I wasn't able to find any information that stated she was fitted with such curtains. Now, those are my quick little picks from the actual Board of Inquiry. There is a lot more information if you want to go have a look at it. It's about 30 odd pages long. I would highly recommend reading it. It's a really good document to read, and there is a link in the description below if you want to have a little quick read. By 1985, the Atlantic Container Line would continue the name of the Atlantic Conveyor with the next ship, following the co-row idea. The MV Atlantic Conveyor, note the subtle difference between SS and MV. However, she would be built by Swan Hunter, the same yard who built the original one, and she would be launched in April 1984 and completed in 1985. However, this Atlantic Conveyor would actually serve a lot longer than her predecessor, where she'd actually unfortunately be broken up and scrapped in October 2017 in Alang in India. In June 2007, a memorial to those lost on the original Atlantic Conveyor was unveiled at Cape Pembroke, the most easterly point in the Falkland Islands, near the now disused lighthouse. Now, up until this point, she's the only vessel sunk in the conflict who actually didn't have a memorial. Now, the memorial features a propeller and shaft that has been aligned on the magnetic bearing of 62 degrees to indicate the point, 90 miles out, where the MV Atlantic Conveyor had finally come to rest. And to finish this video off, I think it's a nice way to finish off by remembering the gentlemen who remain on patrol on board this vessel, going down with the ship. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so that's the end of that video. Hopefully you learned something new, because I most certainly did. Now, if you want to go and support the channel, there is a link in the description below to the Patreon page. I would recommend doing it, but it's up to you. Also, if you want to come and talk to me, there's a link in the description for the Discord channel. There's a couple of good guys over there. We talk about a wide variety of stuff. So yeah, so thanks for watching, guys. Hit that notification button to stay up to date with what I'm uploading. And obviously give it a like, give it a subscribe if you really want to, and comments always good. I like reading your comments. So take care. Catch you next time.